Mage Storytime, Episode 6 Explosions. This is the continuing story of the Iron Goldfish, a party of role-players who awakened as mages. Our cast includes Alwi, who manipulates time with his phone; Bard, a mind and spirit mage who uses superheroes as his gods; Critical, who improves the luck of others through his own pain; Handy, a correspondence-using thief who steals items at long range; Tello, a postmodern mage who uses a hodgepodge of skills to manipulate forces and matter; and Weeb, who uses his life skills to enhance his martial arts and Chinese medicine. Baker, having been unimpressed by our successes with the werewolves, success in this case meaning making it out of the conversation alive, and not finding the rat spirit too hygienic, returned to her bakery for the time being. We made lots of tasteless jokes about Marco putting buns in her oven, and Bard determined that it would become the basis for a Harlequin romance. The tagline: "Like yeast, love rises." In the downtime between our scheduled meetings, several of us put our efforts into improving the shop, doing some word-of-mouth and online marketing, tidying the place up, although the dust and gloom seemed to re-establish itself within a few minutes of each cleaning, and doing other minor things to improve the place. We were managing to do enough business to stay afloat, which wasn't bad for only being open a few weeks, so everyone was happy. On a different note, Bard also did some research and determined that the werewolves we had met, insulted, and fled from last time were most likely glasswalkers, an urban type of lycanthrope that dealt more with the weaver and stasis than with the wild and dynamic creation. Maybe the knowledge would prove useful if we dealt with them again in the future, but for now it drove home the need to do our research before charging into situations. Armed with our letter of introduction from their totem spirit, the rat, we assembled the next Wednesday to drive north to Frisco and try to find their node, or cairn, or magical place. We weren't really up to date on proper terminology. In order to show our allegiance, Alwi went to a local rodent-themed children's entertainment venue and acquired as much verminous paraphernalia as he could lay his hands on. Apparently, stupid was contagious, as everyone failed to stop this. In fact, with the exception of Tello, Alwi had us all convinced, and we bought hats with mouse ears to blend in. We knew the werewolves regularly met around the northeast corner of the parking lot, but we decided to scope out the store first. Shopping for silver belt buckles, fudge, and other potential werewolf defense was suitably accomplished, and we spread out some to try and investigate. Several young clerks were loitering in the middle of the large convenience store, visibly awaiting the end of their shifts, while a tall, pale, thin manager type with oiled hair hovered possessively around the registers. Our clever pumping of the personnel for information led us to discover that the location was a fairly new franchise and had brought some much-needed work to the northern side of the suburb, where the burbs began shifting to the rural. To their knowledge, there wasn't anything suspicious or controversial about the building project. No sacred land, endangered species, or hippie protests had marred the construction. It was just a nice convenience store, so far as they knew. While Bard and Critical wandered around looking for the node, Weeb and Alwi approached the thin man, whose manners and dress practically screamed manager. Upon inquiry, the man confirmed their suspicions. They complimented the barbecue sandwiches and tried to engage him in conversation, but his reactions were best described as cold. Not offensive, but he clearly didn't want to engage in small talk with these random people. Suspecting something, Weeb surreptitiously began to sniff him for anything dog-smelling. Tello, watching from a slight distance, also double-checked his face to make sure he wasn't the man in black that we had somehow failed to notice before. He wasn't, but everyone was obviously disturbed by his off-putting manner. He seemed more like a mortician than a manager, and we took to thinking of him as Lurch. Still convinced that the guy was off, Weeb used his life abilities to try to feel the guy out, and couldn't feel him at all. He could feel all of us, and the clerks in the store, but he couldn't feel any life coming from the manager. He turned to the rest of the group and started mouthing, "Undead." Then he and Alwi returned to their polite small talk, trying to convince him that they didn't know something was wrong. Finding out that the man was a new immigrant to Texas, the pair turned their Texan up to 11, howdying and yee-hawing their hearts out. It was aggressively Texan, and the undead fiend soon welted in the face of Weeb's friendliness, inventing a reason to disengage and find somewhere else to be. During this exchange, Alwi had been sidling around the pair, subtly opening and scattering salt packets in a circle. When the undead walked away, however, he simply stepped over it without noticing. When questioned, all Alwi would say was, "It worked on TV. Why shouldn't it work here?" We regrouped, whereupon Weeb formally informed us of the undead nature of the manager. Handy tried to sense any electrical field or radio waves or something that might indicate robotics, but he seemed to be a regular physical body, just lacking any life force. Tello decided to look for something spiritual, as vampires in White Wolf games had some sort of beast spirit attached to their souls. And when she looked, there was indeed some monstrous beast attached to the spiritual form of the man, hanging on its back and gnawing on his head. Vampire confirmed. Looking out of the glass doors, she also spotted a number of bane spirits which seemed to drift around the parking lot in a sort of Brownian motion. Having identified a potential supernatural threat, we decided it would be the better part of valor to go and find our supposed allies. Or, to be exact, Alwi declared, "Let's get a butt-ton of jerky and go make friends." Which we did. We took our massive purchases of jerky and beer and marched across the parking lot to some of the rest area-style tables set up on the grass around the perimeter of the lot. From there we had both a clear view of the node sitting at the edge of the parking lot and easy access to trash and recycling cans, because we wanted the werewolves to know we were friends of nature. While we waited, Handy decided to practice his magical abilities using a stuffed beaver toy he had purchased, but he got yelled at when he suggested the idea to the rest of us. We all remembered that werewolves didn't like mages, and flaunting our powers/identities didn't seem the best way to make an impression on our new friends. Handy insisted that it would be fine, and began to use his knowledge of the very forces that underwrote the physical universe to practice some ventriloquist act. Saviors of the world, that's us. From behind us, we heard a deep, growling voice mutter, "Douchebags," causing Weeb to start screaming, "I told you so!" as he hit Handy over the head with a bag of jerky. Handy tried to defend himself, saying, "Tell me that wasn't adorable," but was shouted down once again. The sentiment was seconded when a large, furry arm with massive claws reached out and ripped the head off the stuffed beaver. "So, you must be the guys," the voice growled, as 3 werewolves stepped just far enough out of the shadowy trees behind us to present a dim outline. "Yeah, we're the Friends of Rat," Weeb said, flourishing the letter. "Well, we were specifically told, and I quote, 'Listen before you eat them.' So give me your pitch." "We're looking for help fighting bane spirits, which work for your enemy, so that's incentive to help right there. Plus, we help you fight this Wyrm Corporation however we can," said Talo. "And we'll give you jerky," Alwi added. "I don't know. I'm not sure I want to help you corrupt one of nature's well springs," the werewolf rumbled. "Well, it's in a mall, so I don't know how natural it can be, but the node is currently owned by agents of the Wyrm, so it can only become less corrupted in our ownership. Plus, we'd be open to any suggestions you have about improving the area or pleasing Gaia. We're trying to be better than most," pleaded Weeb. And for once, our luck held, as the wolves seemed to believe in his sincerity. Or, based on our headgear, he thought we were too stupid to be dangerous and that he could take the node from us later. Either way, it was a win. "All right. We can work together, I suppose. You wizards up for blowing some shit up?" That was the right thing to say, and we all started to pass around the jerky and beer as we came up with a plan for dealing with the worm-tainted organization. The plan was not exactly detailed. The werewolves intended to wait until late at night when the number of customers would be at a minimum before they detonated the underground gas tanks. That would utterly destroy the convenience store and its parking lot, freeing the node that had been paved over. They asked if we had any abilities to hack or overload or otherwise deal with any security footage, and we decided that we could generate enough electricity with magic to wreck things, but chose to wait for a stormy night so that the electric attack would be coincidental. Fortunately, there were thunderstorms expected later in the week. We also asked how they planned to deal with the vampire manager, to which they responded, "The what? Huh, didn't know about that. Well, I guess that explains the worm connection. Look, as big as this explosion will be, it'll probably take him out too. But it might be a good idea to have you guys take him out. After all, how tough can one vampire be? Famous last words, we were to discover. The only wrinkle in our plan was the potential civilian casualties. Neither Bard nor Critical were happy about exploding innocent people, and while the others argued that Wyrm Tainted officially made you not innocent, we weren't exactly eager to kill a bunch of randos either. The werewolves, who had no problem destroying agents of the Wyrm, suggested that we could use the raid on the store to drive the civilians out, where a few werewolves would be stationed around the perimeter of the station to capture and interrogate the clerks or customers for any worm taint. This seemed as bloodless an option as we were liable to get, so we ultimately agreed to it. When the night of the storm came, Weave and Handy took positions outside of the door. Critical, Tello, and Bard started trying to shoo the customers away, and Alwi enacted his cunning plan to distract Vampire. Dressed in a store-bought police officer's uniform, complete with cheesy porn stash, Alwi kicked the glass doors open and shouted, "I'm Officer Karen, and I need to speak with the manager." The hate coming from the manager's eyes was palpable, but he managed to force a smile and say, "How can I help you?" "We've had reports of something shady going on, and I think this place might be a front for a drug ring." "Well, we've had a few problems with taggers and graffiti, but nothing like what you're thinking," returned the shocked vampire manager. "I spoke to Officer Kerrigan from the local PD about it." "There is no Officer Kerrigan at the Frisco PD, you liar!" shouted Alwi, being as abusive as he possibly could. "I believe you're mistaken, sir," replied the vampire, pulling a business card that read, "J. Kerrigan, Detective, Frisco Police." "Now, sir, I think it's time you left," he said, reaching out a hand and resting it on Alwi's shoulders. Before the indignant fake cop could shrug it off, Alwi felt the dominance of a foreign mind. Without another word, the mage crapped his pants, turned, and walked out of the building. While Alwi was losing his dignity, the rest of us managed to get the customers out of the store. The lightning team took Alwi's exit as the signal to begin, and caused a thunderbolt to lance down and strike the transformer, blowing the electricity in a dazzling display. As soon as the lights were out, we heard the arrival of large furry forms, our night vision having been shot by the light show. They told us to clear out the worm forces while they set up the explosives. Avoiding the door where Alwi had left a trail of poo, we charged in. As the manager began reassuring his staff, telling them that they would just wait a few minutes to see if the lights returned, we surprised everyone when we kicked open the, now depowered, automatic doors and piled in. Noticing that the potentially innocent minimum wage workers were still there, Critical started herding them out the door while Bard broadcasted fear and panic through his mind magic, causing the workers to flee en masse into the darkness, where our werewolf allies were waiting for them. Alwi used the darkness and confusion to make a beeline for the in-store showers at the back, focusing on cleaning himself off instead of fighting. We all approved of this tactic. Talo tried to use her spirit magic to directly attack the vampiric creature attached to the manager, but her attack had no effect. Apparently, the power to mess with spirits is a bit different from the power to mess directly with souls. At this point in the fight, the vampire still had no clue that either he or his store were under attack, despite our best efforts to be a legitimate threat. He just stood there, calling out to his fleeing staff, treating us like we were irritating customers who were trying to force our way in. "We're closed," he said as Critical rushed in and attempted to body slam the vampire. The undead swept out of the way of the surprise assault, but only just, and the fight was truly on. Tello reached into the spirit world and summoned a bevy of angry spirits, pulling them into the mundane world to rip and tear at the vampire. As the shadows came alive and attacked the manager, Tello was grateful that the darkness and low visibility prevented any unbelieving witnesses from preventing her magic from working. Unfortunately, reality doesn't like being played with, and the darkness also cut deeply into Tello. The vampire screamed, "What the hell was that? What are you people doing?" "I have no idea," replied Handy as he pulled his bow and fired an arrow at the vampire, catching him in the shoulder instead of the heart where he had aimed. The manager didn't seem to notice as he plucked the shaft from his flesh and broke it in half. Having cleansed himself, a pantsless, dripping wet Alwi forced the bricks in the shower to age drastically, then burst through the soft rubble into the main store, shouting, "Oh yeah! Officer Karen's back!" For his part, the vampire seemed intent on not noticing Alwi, and instead teleported to Tello, who had summoned the darkness to harm him, and tore into her with the wicked claws he had sprouted, cutting deep gouges into her stomach. As she dropped to the ground, Weeb ran up and poked the manager in the back, forcing arcs of lightning into his body and causing the vamp to convulse slightly. Not nearly as much as Weeb had hoped, however, as the vampire pulled away from his shocking grasp. He dodged an attack from Critical, who tried to bop him on the bonce with a sap, and then burst through another wave of the darkness summoned by Talo. Aoi, unimpressed by the dexterity of the night creature, pulled his pistol, stepped up to the vamp, said, "Dodge this," and fired. When the muzzle smoke cleared, the vampire stood staring at us from a few inches to the left of where he had been. It seemed he had dodged that. As Aoi chuckled nervously and tried to pull away, the vampire lashed out at him with his fist and sent the mage flying across the store and into the wall with a thud. Seeing his friends fall, Weeb again struck the vampire with his fists. Aiming for the chi points that Weeb had studied in his former life, he channeled lightning through his body and into the monster, arcing it across the creature's torso. Unfortunately, Weeb was perhaps too enthusiastic, and the magical shock sent him and the vampire flying in opposite directions. Sensing an attack of opportunity, Critical swung his sap again and hit this time. The vampire blinked and simply looked irritated. Annoyed that his attack hadn't worked better, Critical pulled his secret weapon, a magic D20. Critical had earned his name by having the most one-sided rolls possible during our former D&D campaigns. In his hands, the weakest of goblins could manage a total party kill. And when he threw the D20 at the vampire, he rolled a 15. Sparks started to fly from the plastic bauble, and the vampire's arm was suddenly the grounding point for thousands of volts. His arm was left a singed and mangled ruin, but unfortunately for us, that didn't stop the vampire. If anything, it just made him mad. Bard tried to draw the vampire's attention, shouting, "Your mother was a peasant whore!" Which is probably true, 'cause you're a vampire, and you're old, you douche. It wasn't the wittiest barb, but it was reinforced with his mind magic. Bard sent the vampire the mental image of his mother in a peasant blouse doing unseemly things for money. The vampire had apparently had a fairly libertine existence, though, as he seemed mostly unfazed. Still, he was distracted long enough for Tello to rise from the floor and sink her blade in his back. Handy likewise piled on, and, using magic to turn his cell phone's light into sunlight, seared the creature of the night, then stepped back a pace and fired an arrow into the vampire's chest. He missed the heart, but it still put a crimp in the vampire's day. Writhing in pain, he flailed about, lashing out at Critical and Handy, both of whom dodged out of the way with little difficulty. Aoi took a few more shots with his pistol, but somehow managed to hit the spasming figure of the vampire. Critical, seeing his difficulty, asked, "Need a hand?" and reached out, twisting the very essence of fate and causality to enable Aoi to make his shot. He did, and hit the vampire right in the temple. The bullet, combined with the trauma the creature had already suffered, was enough to finally knock him unconscious, and we all set about tying the vampire up before he could come to. A few of the lazier members of the party sat where they were and bled quietly, or tried to return their external organs to an internal state, but we were all alive enough to pull ourselves together and get the vampire secured. Knowing how vampires were supposed to work according to the World of Darkness / White Wolf games, Handy removed the tip from one of his arrows, turning the shaft into a stake, and handed it to Critical with instructions to drive it into the manager's heart. Willing to do the dirty work, Critical located the approximate heart region and drove the wooden stake down with tremendous force. The vampire grunted and then froze with his eyes open, fixed in place. Aoi took the opportunity to teabag the immobile figure. We figured sunlight might destroy it, but fire or grievous bodily harm would work just as well. Ultimately, we turned to the werewolves for advice on what to do. They congratulated us on our victory, and then informed us that there were about 3 minutes left until the whole area exploded. Not having any better ideas, and being short on time, we left the staked vampire sitting on top of the explosives, and retreated to a safe distance to view the fireworks. Even from the supposedly safe distance, a few eyebrows were singed by the massive fireball, and we congratulated ourselves on a job well done. We did see when the same man in black pulled up to the burning crater, stepped out of his car, and began taking notes on a notepad. The werewolves thanked us, and we left our new friends with a promise to meet up again for jerky and beers. We had struck a blow against the Wyrm, and had done it without killing any innocent people. We all felt like true heroes. It wasn't until a week later that we learned that all of the human employees, who we had forgotten about, had been interrogated lethally by the werewolves. None of them knew anything about the Wyrm, and there was no evidence that the company had been anything more sinister than the average American corporation. For all they could figure out, the vampire just worked there because he needed a job. So, yeah, we killed several innocent people and committed domestic terrorism. 3 cheers for the heroes. What interesting people will the iron goldfish meet, harass, or kill next? Will they suffer any repercussions? What will get blown up next? Find out in the next Mage Storytime.